Boston, Massachusetts, the cradle of liberty, the birthplace of American independence, Paul Revere's home, and of the Old North Church, where his lanterns were hung, the very places where our nation began. By 1775, Massachusetts residents had been governing themselves for nearly a century and a half. The citizens of Boston had substantially more liberties than their counterparts in London. Political lifestyles had grown so far apart that people on opposite sides of the Atlantic were, in effect, speaking different languages. It all goes back to the Puritans, who arrived on these shores in 1630 seeking religious liberty. This process of self-government was unique in the Western world. Owing no debts to anyone, they ran their own affairs. In the mid-1700s, severely drained, the royal treasury and the authorities in London sought to raise revenue from the colonies. This led to riots, protests, and the bloody massacre in 1770. Our trip started bright and early, primarily on foot. Our first stop was to visit the Old South Meeting House. This meeting house is one of the shrines of the American Revolution. In this church, Boston citizens would meet to demand their rights from British officials. Besides visiting the oldest commercial building in Boston, our next step was to visit the oldest public building still standing in the eastern United States, the Old State House. The Declaration of Independence was read atop this building. And not to mention the most notorious incident from this location, the Boston Massacre from 1770. It's hard to walk through Boston without passing some historical cemeteries. The first cemetery on our list was the King's Chapel Burying Ground, located right next to the King's Chapel. This cemetery is the first and oldest burying place, first used just a few months after the town was settled in 1630. There are more than a few historical figures buried within this cemetery, one of which is Mary Chilton, the first pilgrim to touch land in America. William Patty, whose 1658 gravestone is the oldest still extant in Boston. Boston is home to America's first subway system, and this is a ventilation shaft installed in 1898. Another well-known tombstone you'll find at this site is of Elizabeth Payne, also known as Hester Prynne, the fictional heroine of Nathaniel Hawthorne's novel, The Scarlet Letter. Or at least the inspiration for it. You're not wrong. Certainly one of the more beautiful buildings in the city is Boston's Old City Hall, erected in 1864. This was also the site of the Boston Latin School, established in 1635. For a decade, classes were held in the schoolmaster's home. Then in 1645, the first school building was built on this site. This structure would, however, be removed about a century later to make room for the enlarged King's Chapel that stands today. You'll find two statues on this site, one of Josiah Quincy, who was Boston's second mayor, and one of Benjamin Franklin, the Latin school's most famous dropout.
Don't look at me that way, Dad. I'm trying my bestest.
I'm so disappointed in you, John. You've done nothing with your life.
The historical site and of the Ruth's Chris Steakhouse. One of the more popular cemeteries in Boston is the Granary Burying Ground. Within its bounds lie buried 3 signers of the Declaration of Independence, 9 governors of Massachusetts, the 5 victims of the Boston Massacre, Benjamin Franklin's parents, and Paul Revere. In the center of the cemetery is the Franklin Cenotaph, marking the grave of Benjamin Franklin's parents, Josiah and Abiah. Benjamin Franklin himself is buried in Philadelphia. Hugging the fence line, you'll find a tall pillar that marks the tomb of John Hancock. This stone is a replacement. The original tombstone actually disappeared over a century ago.
Right there,
Where?
right where my hand is pointing. Can't you see it?
Thank you. On the farther right side of the entrance, you'll find the grave of Paul Revere, patriot and son of liberty. This hero of the famous Midnight Ride was also an able craftsman. He lived another 43 years till 1818.
Hi.
And here lies Samuel Adams, the organizer of the Revolution. It is often said that it was Hancock's money and Adams's brain that fueled the revolt. Adams's fiery writings, combined with his deft political maneuvering, kept public passions roused for years. And appropriately, next to Adams's grave is that of the 5 victims of the Boston Massacre: Samuel Gray, Samuel Maverick, James Caldwell, Crispus Attucks, and Patrick Carr. And buried next to them is Christopher Snyder, a young boy killed by a Tory in another incident 11 years earlier. He was the first victim of the struggles between the colonists and the mother country. And right next door, where the old granary used to sit, is now the Park Street Church, established and built in 1809. This church holds many firsts, including the first Sunday school in 1817, the first prison aid society in 1824, and it was the first to send missionaries to Hawaii in 1819. With its gilded dome, the State House is by far the most iconic building in Boston. Construction began in 1795, and 3 years later it was completed. 15 white horses, one for each state in the Union, pulled the cornerstone up the hill where Samuel Adams and Paul Revere presided over its laying. Facing Beacon Street, you'll find the memorial for Robert Shaw and his 54th Massachusetts Regiment. When the Civil War broke out in 1861, many of the Massachusetts black residents wanted to join in the fight to free their enslaved brethren, but the U.S. Army policy prohibited blacks from enlisting. Robert Shaw was one of the few that came forward to lead these black troops.
It doesn't say
say so.
Boy, that's
I'm not gonna listen.
the size that was a neat tree. I'd be climbing all over that thing too.
Yeah, she came, but now can't see me if I do this.
Like, Jack was like, I'm pretty sure she's a 5.
The Church of the Covenant began construction in 1865. This was Boston's first Presbyterian church. You may recognize this church from the 1999 film Boondock Saints.
In broad daylight, they watched.
During the 1890s, the church went through a drastic change. A new paint scheme, mosaics, and 42 Tiffany stained glass windows were installed. The huge chandelier in the middle was also installed, and at the time, it was the largest electrical light on display to the public. I'm sure you all remember the American sitcom Cheers. It ran from 1982 to 1993, spanning 275 episodes and 11 seasons. The only thing used in the show, mind you, was just the exterior shot. The interior was a set. It's currently used as a very popular restaurant and a nostalgia trip for people who grew up watching the show.
Wow, this is insane.
Yeah.
What's he doing? See Otis? Okay. That's okay.
So where we going, boss?
Straight.
Bruins, more like Booins.
Nothing has quite the fame than that of Samuel Adams' Indian Caper, or the Boston Tea Party, as it's known. The Boston Tea Party was the turning point of the protests that led to the Revolution. Parliament had levied a tax on tea in 1767, but this law was ineffective. At first, boycotts prevented taxed tea from being sold. Then smuggled tea from Holland undercut the price of the legal taxed tea. By 1773, the East India Company was nearly bankrupt, with millions of pounds of unsold tea in its London warehouses.
You're so pretty.
The Tea Act was essentially a bailout of the East India Company. The Tea Act gave the company a 1 shilling per pound subsidy on all tea sold in America. Now the company could undersell the smugglers and get rid of its surplus tea at a profit. Bostonians would have none of this. If the royal officials could do this with tea, they could do it with other goods. No merchant or shop owner would be safe. Furthermore, the Tea Act was seen as a ruse to get the colonists to pay the 3-penny tax, which they had so long opposed. And thus, the Tea Party began.
If he poops on you, I'm gonna laugh.
Participants and observers alike marched to the Griffin's Wharf, boarded the 3 tea ships, and began dumping the tea. 342 chests, half chests, and quarter chests of tea were destroyed, weighing approximately 92,000 pounds in all. That's about 18 million cups of tea.
Dinosaurs.
Boasting more than 450,000 pieces of artwork, the Boston Museum of Fine Arts has one of the most comprehensive collections in the Americas. Established in 1870, it is now the 20th largest art museum in the world. This museum possesses materials from a wide variety of art movements and cultures, which includes the largest Japanese art collection outside of Japan. Certainly my favorite section was the ancient Egyptian artifacts, which include sculptures, sarcophagi, and jewelry. With more than 140 objects ranging in date from about 1700 BC to 300 AD, the Mummies Gallery introduces visitors to the gods and goddesses who inhabited the underworld. Dominating the gallery is the massive black stone sarcophagus lid of Khepera, a general in the 16th century BC.
How much you want to bet they sell miniature versions of it in the gift shop?
Probably.
This sculpture, made out of glass and steel, is appropriately called the Lime Green Icicle Tower, made in 2011 by Dale Chihuly. This oil painting is called Watson and the Shark, painted by John Singleton Copley in the late 1700s. Here are two very popular George Washington paintings. One is called The Passage of the Delaware by Thomas Sully in 1819. And this one was painted by Gilbert Stuart, commissioned by Samuel Parkman in 1806. This was later gifted to the town of Boston on the 30th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah, I like the dark wood. He's got servers, did I catch that?
But we didn't get to see all that up there though.
We rented a vehicle and began driving north. We stopped at the Charleston Navy Yard. For the better part of 2 centuries, the Charleston Navy Yard serviced, supplied, and built the ships of the United States Navy. Activity in the Naval Yard reached its greatest peak during World War II. Up to 5,000 workers, including 8,500 women, built, equipped, and repaired the Navy fleet. Rosie the Riveter and her male and female co-workers built 159 ships and repaired another 3,200 here in Charleston. All of this came to an end in 1974 when President Richard Nixon ordered the Navy Yard closed. Many Bostonians still claim that the decision was made to spite Massachusetts, the only state to have voted against Nixon in 1972. The southwesternmost part of the Navy Yard, meanwhile, has been preserved as a national park. Within its boundaries, exhibits and displays are offered, and 2 historical ships, the Constitution and Cass and Young, are open for tours. This is the USS Cass and Young, a Fletcher-class destroyer. Launched and commissioned late in 1943, the Cass and Young saw heavy action in the South Pacific. The most celebrated ship in American history, the USS Constitution, now the oldest commissioned warship afloat in the world. The ship, known as Old Ironsides, has been the pride of our nation's naval heritage for over 2 centuries. During Constitution's battle in 1812, an unnamed seaman cried out, "Huzzah! Her sides are made of iron. See where the shot fell out?" Thus coining the nickname Ironsides. "Don't fire till you see the whites of their eyes," a famous quote by Colonel Prescott during the battle at Bunker Hill. British-held Boston was surrounded on all sides by rebel ground. High hills overlooked the city from both north and south. Whoever controlled these hills would command the harbor. Recruits for the newly developed New England Army poured into Cambridge, while British reinforcements arrived in Boston. American intelligence learned of the British's plans, just in time to thwart them. So, on the night of June 16, 1775, about 1,000 New England soldiers marched to Charleston. Still a cause for confusion today, the real battle took place 1 hill over, on Breed's Hill, not Bunker Hill. British troops made 3 assaults on June 17th. To conserve precious gunpowder, the Americans had orders not to fire till they saw the whites of their eyes, orders which proved to be a stroke of genius. The British regulars advanced further and further up the hill, meeting no response. Row and row of redcoats began to fall as Americans began to fire. By the 3rd attack, it became clear the Americans ran out of gunpowder. The retreat was orderly, but their casualties mounted because they could no longer fight back. Bunker Hill was technically a British victory. Publicly, General Gage called it a complete victory. However, privately, he felt it a loss. Nearly 1,054 of his men were killed or wounded, which was about half of those who fought. Compare that to the 441 American soldiers killed that same day. American patriot General Nathaniel Greene summed it up well. "I wish I could sell them another hill at the same price." Boston proved to be an amazing place. Here, where the gathering places of the Patriots, the incubators of revolution, the buildings where American resistance to the British crown were born, grew and flourished, until eventually the only alternative was war and independence. All Americans at some point should visit Massachusetts for its weather, its history, its parks, its people, its food, and everything in between. To learn more about the Freedom Trail, read The Complete Guide to Boston's Freedom Trail, 4th edition by Charles Bain.